All right. Well, thank you everyone for being with us. Today I'm going to conclude the series of talks on being and becoming. For those on YouTube, I'm holding up the book. This is Fenwick Holmes, Being and Becoming, and the subtitle is The Principles and Practice of the Science of Spirit. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the book kind of goes in print and they sell off what they've run and then it comes out of print. And for that reason, the price fluctuates up and down. This copy that I'm holding in my hand was marked $5, and I think I bought it in the mid-90s, and I think now new ones on Amazon are about 20. But if you watch, you'll find one, perhaps even a used one, and I highly recommend that everybody have a copy of that book and take it out from time to time and read it. It is one of the best, if not the best, succinct explanations of what our teaching is all about. It was written in 1918. Fenwick was Ernest Holmes' brother, and together they were known as Emersonian lecturers, and out of that grew the textbook that we have come to know as The Science of Mind. So it's a very good foundational text. It's very simple, but it's very profound. Fenwick said that he wrote it so you could read it at one sitting, and you can. And I've been talking about it for 3 weeks, and we're not even going to finish the book. That's how profound it is. So today, where we want to come together is a part where Fenwick started to introduce us to this idea of personal spirit, personal God. And before we can get into that, I think we need to understand the difference between the intellect and the difference between feeling and emotion. In our part of the world, in our culture, the intellect is supreme. The intellect is almost worshipped. There's this idea that the intellect can know everything that there is to be known. And of course, it's the intellect itself that tells us that, right? And that's a logical fallacy, because anything that is self-affirming may or may not be true. But nevertheless, the intellect says, I am right because I say I am right. And anytime anyone or anything says I'm right because I say I'm right, that's when we should take 2 steps back, whether it be a politician, whether it be a preacher, whether it be a book, doesn't matter. We should determine if it's right. Emerson said, don't take anybody's word for what's right or wrong or good or bad, but find out for yourself. I think it's the Gospel of John that says, you must try these gods to see if they're false gods. I mean, the same kind of idea. You've got to decide for yourself. I was watching a lecture. The Dalai Lama was in London many years ago and was giving a lecture on the Four Noble Truths. And after lectures, he would have Q&A. And a young Buddhist monk came up and asked him a question that I have no idea. I don't remember what it was, but it had something to do with a basic tenet of Tibetan Buddhist principles. And the Dalai Lama answered his question. Then he gave him references to the different Buddhist scriptures where he could find it. And then he said to the young man, he said, but that's not good enough. That's not good enough. I don't want you to believe it because I said so. I don't want you to believe it because the scripture said so. I want you to go and work with it until you decide whether you believe it or not. We must decide for ourselves. We must explore. We can't take anybody's word. So if we stop and think about our culture, our Western culture, it is founded upon Greek philosophy. Our system of logic and reason that came to us largely from the Greeks. Now, there are other philosophies in the world, but our culture has been greatly influenced by the Greeks. And you may remember Aristotle's rhetorical triangle back 500 years before Christ. Aristotle gave us the rhetorical triangle. There was a group of people called the Sophists, and they were very, very skilled orators. They were very skilled at rhetoric. And they could make things sound reasonable and seem reasonable that were in fact wrong. Okay? And they were using this power of oratory to swindle people. Now, fast forward 2,500 years, and what has changed is they've gotten very, very, very much better at what they're doing. But Aristotle thought if he gave us this rhetorical triangle that perhaps people would be able to separate the fake news, if you want to speak of it in those terms, the things that were being presented as sounding fair and sounding reasonable but weren't, from that which was literally true or actually true. And the rhetorical triangle, we all learn it in English 101 in college. A rhetorical triangle has 3 points: ethos, pathos, and logos. And ethos means is the person presenting the information qualified to do so, you know. These days it's a robot making up news stories and posting them on social media, and nobody bothers to question, well, who said that? Pathos means the emotional appeal, because Aristotle realized that a lot of the reason that the sophists were winning was because they appealed to people's emotions. They were tugging on the emotions. So how much is this piece that, you know, that we're reading or that we're watching on television, how much is it an emotional tug? And then there was logos, and logos meant, does it make logical sense? Is what they're saying make logical sense? And then Aristotle went and gave us rules for thinking, if you will, you know, rules of logic, and you can actually go on the internet and you can read, and there's page after page after page that tells you about logical fallacies and how to detect them. And as much as Aristotle tried to warn us, I think, you know, the idea has failed miserably that people today at least would use this tool, because we get immediately caught up in the emotional tug. And I call them the propagandists, people with agendas. They know that, and they lead with the emotional tug. And as soon as people get hooked emotionally, their ability to ask, you know, is this person qualified to speak, or is the logic that they're using sound? That ability goes away as soon as they get tugged emotionally. That's why when the news comes on at night, the breaking news story is always one that arouses anger or fear, usually anger or fear. Because once they hook you into the emotion of anger or fear, logic and reason kind of goes out the window. The other thing is that this system of logic that the Greeks gave us is itself an incomplete system. And yet our society and our culture and our science, we take it as being absolutely true. Now, in that system of logic, if you think about it, something is either true or it is false. It is or it is not. And yet there's an older system of logic that comes to us from the East, from India and Tibet and places like that. And that system of logic says that a thing might be true, it might be false, it might be both true and false at the same time, and it might be neither true nor false. Now we listen to that here. We've all gone to school in this country. We listen to that. We say, well, that's absolute gibberish. That's absolute nonsense. How could that be? How could something be both true and false, or neither true nor false? It is or it is not, you know. And I was watching a lecture or a conference on the internet, and the speaker was Henry Stapp, S-T-A-P-P, if you want to look it up this afternoon and watch snippets yourself. And he was discussing the fact that our logic, that system of logic that we use that says a thing is either true or false, that system of logic is preventing us from understanding the world as it is. That when you get into the world of quantum mechanics, we cannot understand quantum mechanics because our system of logic doesn't explain it. It doesn't agree with our system of logic. And if you've read Schrodinger's cat, you know, all of the different things that talk about quantum mechanics, the thing may be, or it may not be, or it could be both, or it could be neither. You know, is Schrodinger's cat dead, or is it alive, or is it both dead and alive in two different boxes, or is it neither dead nor alive? You know. And what Stapp's point is that in our scientific community, if we are to break through to the next level of understanding, we have to go back and adopt a different system of logic than the one that we've been using, the one that the Greeks gave to us. Now that kind of transfers, that whole concept kind of transfers or transposes over perfectly to where we find ourselves in our spiritual growth, Because our intellect wants to tell us that we can understand, that we can know. And yet that which we call God, that which we call spirit, that which we call the divine, is so much more than the intellect is capable of understanding. We perceive things as having beginnings, middles, and ends. And the divine is that which always was and always will be and was never began and will never end. We perceive of things as having limits in power, limits in knowledge. But the divine is all powerful. The divine is all knowing. So we have this same kind of quandary in that the human intellect and the system of logic that we use is not capable of understanding the world of quantum mechanics, or describing it at least. And the world of spirit is something that is beyond the intellect. It is a feeling, it is an emotion, it is an experience. And this is where Fenwick starts the next discussion. We have to kind of come to some feeling about what is this thing called God. And one of the discussions that people have, I would go around to different places and be introduced as a minister, a religion science minister, and other ministers who were there who had no idea what religious science was. Typically their first question was, well, is your God a personal God or is your God an impersonal God? And that's kind of like the true or false question. It's like, it's either one or the other. And I never quite understood the question. I never quite understood, well, what did people mean by a personal God? What is their definition of this? And I was kind of mulling it around. And I know I've told you this. Lori and I were taking a class one time with a professor of Hindu philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill. He was teaching some classes out at the Hindu temple in Morrisville, North Carolina. And we had an opportunity to go sit with him for a few weeks and kind of have our minds expanded, I guess. And he said, with regards to this question, is God a personal God or is God an impersonal God? He posed the question, I didn't ask it. He said, well, if God is everything, then God must be both personal and impersonal. God must be personal, God must be impersonal, God must be both, and God must be neither. And he just kind of chuckled because he knew he had lit a fuse. Something was smoldering. But I had to go explore and say, what is that? What does that mean? What is that all about? And years later, I kind of backed into the Hindu philosophy and the Hindu logic, and I understood what he was saying. So we have to kind of come to some agreement within ourselves with this idea of God being a personal God, God being an impersonal God. Or maybe neither, or maybe both. And what does that mean to us? And I think the reason for that is what I finally came to accept as the common definition when people are asking me, is God a personal God or an impersonal God? Is, does God act like a person? Does God act like a person who knows you as another person? And if we look through the Old Testament, we look through the New Testament, I think we've got to take a step back and understand that what we are reading is people's explanation, people's understanding, and we are all trying to understand and explain that which is beyond understanding and that which is beyond explanation. And we're describing the ineffable. and it's a fool's errand at best. There's no way that you can possibly succeed, but that doesn't keep us from trying to explain it. And if we look back through what in our culture we're most familiar with here, the Old Testament, God is a person. God is just like a king of a Middle Eastern country. Has moods and mood swings, and is angry and has enemies, and gives things and then takes those things back, and withholds things, and punishes people and tests people and tries them, and all these kind of human attributes. And I think we have to recognize then that what has happened is that humanity has created God in their image and likeness. Now we say that God created us in its image and likeness, and that is true. We are the same stuff in substance and essence. It is us, we are it, kind of thing. But in our understanding, human beings have rationalized and justified and made God just like themselves, just like they want to be. And they have used that justification to perform all kinds of cruel acts on one another. It's okay to slaughter these other people because they're not like us. It's okay to take from these other people because they're God's enemies, and all kinds of things like that. That's, to me, that's the personal God. Now another kind of explanation or another feeling of the personal God is that God is personal to you. God knows you. God cares about you. God loves you. God loves me. Those kind of things. And in that regard, I think we all have to say yes. If that is our definition of personal, is that God knows me and God loves me and God cares for me and all those things, we would have to say yes. That type of personal. That if that's the definition of personal, we can certainly agree with that. But the idea of God as a person, God as a personality, God as an individual, is something that we would have to step away from, because that's not possible for God to be in our understanding of God. If God is all that there is, and God has created everyone and everything out of itself, then it has no sense of self and other. It has no otherness about it. So if I say that I am Jim and I am an individual and I am a person and I have a personality, what I am really saying is that I'm different than everyone else. I'm you, I'm me, you're you. We're different, we're separate, we're unique, those kind of things. But the divine, being all, doesn't have that. So it doesn't have that sense of personhood that we here in this experience that we know to be personhood. It has a sense of being. It is. It is. So now we come to this kind of thing about, well, let me jump in for a minute about impersonal God. Impersonal God. Sometimes when we are studying or just beginning to study science of mind, and we talk about the law of mind. There's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. It's easy to lose the loving feeling of oneness with the divine, and to think of God as just a blind force acting as nature, a blind force acting through nature, a blind force that responds to us according to our belief without a care. If we wish to do harm to ourselves, it lets us do harm to ourselves. If we wish to do something that is joyful, then it lets us do something that is joyful. But it is totally disconnected from that experience with us. This might be at least to my understanding, this might be kind of the deist philosophy. You might have heard that Thomas Jefferson and some of the founding fathers were deists. The divine created the universe. It set up the rules and regulations, or the laws of physics and the laws by which it's done unto us according to our belief. And then it stepped back and just kind of lets everything go. Kind of like the explanation I've heard is kind of like winding the clock and then taking your hand off the key and walking away and letting the clock wind itself down. So that would be kind of a view of an impersonal God. It set up the rules. It set up the regulations. Gravity acts, electricity acts, chemistry acts, and there's a power that acts upon our thoughts. But it is not involved in. It does not care about what we're doing. That is all up to us. So that's a very impersonal view, and we have to kind of come to some sort of an understanding that is God personal, is God impersonal. And here's the way that Fenwick talks about it. Here's the way that I would like to explain it, because this is important. This is absolutely most important. The divine itself is impersonal in that it is not a person, a personhood, an individual, separate or apart or different than all of the rest of its creation. It is a person in the sense that it is aware, it is conscious, it knows, and it knows that it knows. Right? So that quality of consciousness, that quality of beingness, just pure beingness, and we say spirit is being without form. Now, it's kind of difficult to understand because spirit is always cloaking itself in form. It can never be without form, but spirit is not the form. Spirit is expressing itself as the form. So you want to think that back beyond the form, there's this intelligence, there's this awareness, there's this knowingness, there's this isness, this suchness, this I amness. And it is a person in that regard, that it is aware, but it is aware without being self-aware. It is aware. And it is expressing itself through each and every part of its creation as individualized expressions of itself, and that's you and I. That's all creation, but it is you and I. And as you and I, it is personal. As spirit, it is impersonal. It is both personal as us, and impersonal as all, you see. So it is both personal and impersonal. And it's that feeling that we want to stay with. It is that feeling. The mystical union, the feeling of kindredness, of oneness, of love. So Fenwick asks us to consider then, is there a purpose? Does spirit have a purpose? Why would that which is already everything, why is that which has everything, why would it create? Why would it create you and I? Why would it create the blade of grass? Why would it create the fishes in the sea, or the stars, or the planets? Why would it do anything? Why would it do anything? And if we contemplate it long enough, if we read what Fenwick has to tell us, if we read back through the Science of Mind textbook, if we read other writings, if we read Ralph Waldo Trine, Rumi, we come to an understanding that spirit's purpose of creation is to express itself. That's it. To express itself. And the impulse, Dr. Holmes tells us, is the impulse to create, he describes as love because it is spontaneous and it is joyful. So out of joy and out of spontaneity, Spirit creates. Spirit creates, not to test, not to punish, but to express itself. To express itself. And what Fenwick is inviting us to consider is that our purpose, your purpose and my purpose, our purpose of being here on this planet at this time is to allow Spirit to express itself as us in a joyful, loving, spontaneous manner. We really have to step back. We really have to step back and think about that, and perhaps stop thinking about that until we feel it. We really have to step back and recognize then that just as the logic and reason that we inherited from the Greeks fails to explain the world as it is, physically, mechanically, at the quantum level, it fails to describe the world as it is at the spiritual level. But there are many, many other ideas that we human beings have accepted as true, and they're not. You see, they're not. And we continue to act as if they were true, and we continue to do things that just aren't so, because they make sense to us, because they make sense to us. But they make sense to us because the very foundation upon which they're built is wrong. And we haven't developed the ability to challenge them, to question them. As we go through Scripture, as you read through Scripture, there are a couple places in the New Testament where this idea is kind of expressed. And it's expressed in the idioms of the Aramaic language, and I think it's lost on us here in the West. And one is you can't put new wine into old skins. You can't put new wine into old skins. To me, what that means to me today is that means that some things are just beyond, so beyond your traditional way of thinking and experiencing and knowing, that you cannot relate the new things to the old things. See, one of the ways that we learn as human beings is we get a new bit of information and we try to associate it with an old bit of information. Oh, I see. Well, that's kind of like this thing that I used to know, or this thing that I learned a long, long time ago. We try to take something new and we try to make it fit with something that we already know. And in many cases when we do that, we miscategorize it. We think it's just like that, and it's not. And this is the parable we get from the East about the four blindfolded men who came across an elephant, and each one had a different part. One had the trunk, one had the side, one had a leg, and one had the tail. And they all tried to relate that to something that they already knew, So one said it's like a wall, another said it's like a tree, and one said it's like a snake, and one said it's like a rope. And of course, it's not any of those. It's not any of those. It's beyond. See, they couldn't get the big picture because they had their blindfolds on. So we try to take things that are new and we try to fit them into old skins. We try to put them into our old buckets, our old ways of thinking. And they just don't fit. So sometimes you have to get rid of the old ways of thinking, and you have to find new ways of thinking. The other is that sometimes you can't repair the house any longer. You have to clean it, scrape it clean to the foundation, and start building anew. And that's the same the same meaning or the same message to me. Every once in a while, we just need to go back and say, you know, everything I knew might have been wrong. Perhaps everything that I knew and the way that I came to know it is wrong. Perhaps there's another way. Perhaps there's a better way. So this trap that we fall into in theological discussions about God being a personal God or an impersonal God is one that we have to break out of, and we have to say both, neither, yes. Now this then brings us to, if we are its instruments of expression, what do we know about the way life works that maybe we need to let go of because it's wrong? Because it's wrong. And we've been told this over and over and over again. We've been told it, and we won't believe it because our eyes tell us it's not so. We need to stop looking with our eyes, and we need to start feeling with our heart. You and I are here as individualized expressions of spirit. You and I are the point where the impersonal becomes personal. You and I are the point where the undifferentiated soul, the undifferentiated spirit, becomes differentiated. I want you to think of a large office building in a big city, and it has literally thousands of windows. And you're looking at the side of the building that's facing the sun. Now, from where you are looking at the sun, there's just one sun. There's just one sun. It is there. You can turn around and look. It's 93 million miles away, according to the scientists. It's been there for over 4 billion years, and it's probably going to be there for another 4 billion years. But to each person in that building standing behind one of those different windows, that sun is personal. It is their sun. They have their flowers on their desks, and they move them around so that their flowers get the sunlight, or they adjust the shades to keep the sun from overheating one part of their office. It is their sun. They experience that sun, which is in itself a universal experience, but they experience it at a personal level. And only as much sunlight as they choose, as they decide, will come through that window. They have the ability to pull the shades or the blinds and block it completely. We have grown up and we have learned that life needs to be a struggle, that we need to eat our bread by the sweat of our brow, that we need to bear our children in pain. We have grown up and we have been taught that life is a test, and that life is a series of punishments, and that we are separated from God, and God is upset with us and angry with us, and somehow we have to work our way back to the garden. We have to have saviors and saints. We have to struggle. We have to struggle. And now we want to step back and say, there is no separation. All of that, those concepts I just mentioned, came from the concepts of God being a person just like anybody else. A person who gets angry, a person who scolds, a person who punishes. And God can be none of those things. So what the secret of life then, what the secret of our purpose, if the purpose of spirit is to express itself, and everything that it creates is for the purpose of self-expression, then that means that you and I, since we are created out of it, we have been created as an outlet for it to express itself. As Emerson said, we are already inlets who may become outlets of the divine. And what we want to do then is we want to release all of these ideas and of life that has to be a struggle and we have to work hard for our money, and we have to release all of those things and recognize that to the degree that I align myself up with Spirit's purpose as me, which is to express itself lovingly and kindly and spontaneously, to the degree that I am able to do that, everything else is provided. Remember in the New Testament, again, people were saying, but what about our money? And what about painting our boats? And what about feeding our children? And what are all these things? You're telling us to come explore these spiritual ideas, but we have practical needs. And the answer was, seek first the kingdom. Everything else will be added. And the kingdom is the experience of the presence of the divine within, which is a feeling, which is not an intellectual aha. It is a feeling. A feeling. So what Fenwick is telling us then is if we are experiencing less in our lives than we know we ought, whether it be in the area of health, whether it be in the area of prosperity, whatever it may be, we don't concentrate on the lack. To go back to an example we used from Ralph Waldo Trine some months ago, Trine gave us the example of a farmer in California who had opened a valve up on the aqueduct and allowed a stream of water to come down into the farmland, and it created a beautiful pond, and the pond was full of flowers and full of trees and full of birds and fish and all kinds of things. That man went away, and the one who came behind him to rent the land turned the valve off. And when the water dried up, the pond went stagnant, and the weeds started to smell, and the fish died, and it became an ugly place. All that needed to be done to restore the beauty and the perfection that was there previously was to open that valve again. Just open the valve again. So when the man returned from his trip and he took back his land, he opened the valve. And the intelligence of life, of spirit, of God, the intelligence that wishes to express itself joyfully, knew what to do. So what we want to do then in our spiritual growth is, rather than try to focus on what we do not have and to talk about what we don't have and to try to, as Goldsmith says, to try to call God down into our human experience to fix it, we want to forget all about that. And we just want to turn to love. We just want to turn to love. Love is the very essence. Love is the healing balm. Love is all that there is. Let's stop thinking about ourselves in such simple, small terms as having to work hard and struggle and pass tests. And let's, in all humility and all awe, step back and recognize that divine love itself is trying to express itself through us more fully, and it knows how to do that, but it requires us to cooperate. It requires us to turn toward it and open ourselves up as a perfect channel for its love. The other thing that we want to recognize is that since the divine has created everyone and everything to express its life, that it is constantly evolving life to a greater capacity or a greater degree of that self-expression of the divine, which means our souls are constantly evolving. Right? So we tend to look, and we tend to look at evolution, and we think that we started with single cell amoebas and things like that, and they evolved and they became multi-celled animals, and they became fishes, and they became plants, and they became mammals and birds, and they became humans. And what Thomas Trower tells us is that every step of the way, every step of evolution, we can see two things that took place with the step. One was a greater intelligence, a greater self-awareness, and the other was a greater mobility. The other thing to consider about our lives is that not only are we here as God's instruments of self-expression and self-love and self-givingness and joy, and the way that we experience that is by feeling the love, by getting into the love, by getting out of our heads and getting into the feeling and acknowledging and recognizing and sitting with that presence, but that we also want to expand our ability to do that. We want to grow in spirit. Now, one of the greatest ways that we can do that is through gratitude, is through blessing each and every one we see. And by blessing, I mean acknowledging the presence and the activity of God in that situation, in that plant, in that animal, in that person, in that child. Can we just stop and recognize the presence and the activity of God? And can we give thanks that we have the ability to do so? You know, it's like we're in a beautiful flower garden and we're wearing a pair of sunglasses that prevents us from seeing the color. But we have the ability to take those glasses off and open ourselves up to the experience of the beauty that is already there. It is up to us to do so. It is up to us to be required to do so. For we have freedom of choice. We have freedom of will. So I suggest we adopt a spiritual practice of gratitude. Just take time to notice the presence of God and the activity of God in everyone and everything about you. Maybe you want to write it down. The other thing that I would suggest is open yourself up to the mystical ideas, to the poets. Art has a way of transcending logic and reason, and as I already said, our system of logic and reason is less than perfect. But art has a way of transcending logic and reason and getting straight to the feeling. The experience of God is a feeling. It is not a logical conclusion. It is a feeling. It is the experience of oneness. It is the experience of complete and unconditional love. Nothing you and I could ever do that would make us worthy of God's love. There's nothing that you and I could ever do that would make us unworthy of God's love, because God is love. God is love. But we can attune ourselves to that love. We can open ourselves up to the experience of that love. So when we read the words of Rumi, read his poetry, and it's available on the web, and there's some beautiful translations. I love Coleman Barks' translation. When we read the ideas of Rumi, and he tells us that beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I will meet you there. I will meet you there. See, our heart responds to that. There's something there that our heart goes aha to, but not our head. Our head says, what? Ideas of right doing and wrong doing? They're not a geographical place. A field is a geographical place. How could you possibly have a geographical place that goes beyond things that aren't, and logic and reason spins itself out of control until it dismisses the whole thing, but the heart goes, aha, I get it. So read the poetry of the mystics. Read the poetry of Gibran. The Prophet, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, is available in PDF format on the web. Take time to read the mystical poets, Dickinson. Take time to read them. Walt Whitman was the unofficial poet of the Transcendentalist movement. Read some of Walt Whitman's. Read it. What we are seeking created us to seek it. It created us to love. It created us to express. Whatever you go to do today, tomorrow, the next day, before you do it, ask yourself, how does this thing that I am about to do give a greater expression to life, to love, to truth, or to beauty? If it doesn't do any of those things, then why do it? Why do it? Does this thing that I wish to do harm another in any way? Does it try to rob from another? Does it try to take anything away from another? Even such as dignity, as an insult. If this thing that I desire to do harms another in some way, then why do it? Then why do it? I think in many cases we may come down to saying, well, this thing that I'm about to do doesn't really bring a lot of joy and doesn't really give me a lot of self-expression, but I have to do it because I have to make a living. And that's where we have to go back to the love. That which has created everything out of itself knows how to provide for itself as us in ways that go beyond our intellectual capability of using flawed logic to figure out, if we will turn to it and let it. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all these things shall be added unto you. So as we come to close with for this year, there's more in Fenwick's book than I could possibly touch on. But as we come to close for this year, I invite you to get a copy of the book and read it from time to time, because every time you read it, it will take you deeper. He starts us off by telling us that we are an integral part of the divine. I am closing the discussion for this year at this part where he says, open yourself up to that mystical experience. Don't pay attention to what flawed logic and reason tell you. Pay attention to your heart. Feel God's presence. Feel God's love. When we open ourselves up to that, then everything else that we need, healings, income, all those things, will show up for us in a way that is appropriate, in a way that gives a greater experience to love, in a way that gives a greater expression to God. So I invite you this day, stop thinking of yourself as a human being. Stop thinking of yourself as being different than and apart from God. In all humility, recognize yourself as a very important channel through which God is expressing. That its purpose is for self-expression and love is the impulse. And from this moment on, align everything you do in your life coming from a place of love, for the purpose of giving God a greater opportunity to express through you and as you. And dedicate yourself on a daily basis to becoming a better instrument, to expanding your spiritual consciousness to become a better instrument through which God may express. The purpose of life is to lovingly express God. Nothing else matters. In gratitude, celebrate that on a daily basis. And so it is.